The halls of Moonshade Manor were cloaked in shadow, each stone wall absorbing the soft footfalls of Liora as she moved like a whisper through the echoing corridors, careful not to draw attention to herself, careful not to let the world see her tremble, though her chest throbbed with a quiet, restless energy she had long learned to contain. She was 17, slender, pale, with eyes that reflected the muted light of the tall, narrow windows that rarely welcomed the sun, a silent omega whose voice had never found its way into the world, and yet within her lay a power so subtle that it could bend the hearts of others, her soul song a ripple of emotion that traveled unseen, felt rather than heard, threading through the air like invisible music, drawing threads of sorrow, joy, fear, and longing into a tapestry only she could weave. And it was this gift, this hidden pulse of empathy, that had saved her in moments no one knew existed, moments where her heart recognized danger and deception long before it arrived. The manor, cold and forbidding, smelled of old wood polish and the faint scent of lavender, long dried, a smell that always reminded her of mornings when her mother had cared enough to brush her hair or place a small ribbon at the nape of her neck. Gestures now faded into memory as distant as the sound of laughter that had once filled these halls, laughter that now turned into whispers and sneers behind her back, the servants and minor nobles calling her the silent shadow and worthless, words that struck her harder than any physical blow, and yet she kept moving, gliding through the manor with the quiet dignity of one who had learned to survive in the spaces others ignored, her hands brushing against carved banisters, her fingertips tracing the worn patterns etched into the wood, a grounding ritual that reminded her she existed, she mattered, even if no one else. He would admit it. She spent her days in silence, tending to the few animals her family allowed her, feeding the birds that dared to approach her window, brushing the stable floors, her soul song humming softly as she moved, sensing the emotions around her, the faint fear of the horses, the melancholy of the servants, the muted joy of the birds, feeling each heartbeat as a note in the invisible symphony she alone could hear. And in these moments, she allowed herself a fleeting comfort, a small sanctuary in which the cruelty of the world could not reach her. But that fragile calm shattered the night of the monthly gathering of Eldrath's minor nobles, when Lord Valen, a tall, arrogant man with a cruel smile and eyes that gleamed with self-importance, stood before the room and spoke her name with derision, calling her a silent shadow unworthy of breath or bond, words that cut through the candlelit hall like a blade, eliciting laughter from some, nods of agreement from others, a chorus of derision that echoed in her chest and left her stomach twisting with shame and helplessness. Celine, her older sister with eyes like shards of ice and a smile too sharp to trust, leaned close to their father, whispering words that set the next chain of events into motion, suggesting that Liora be offered to the one person in Eldrath who could ensure her silence permanently, the Alpha King of Stormhold Citadel, Dorian, the Thunder King, whose roar was said to shatter stone, whose gaze could fracture the soul, and whose trial had claimed the lives of every woman foolish enough to stand before him, no one surviving to tell the tale, a legend so terrifying that even whispers of it chilled those who dared speak of him. Leora's father, a man as cold as the stone walls he ruled, gave a nod, a gesture that sealed her fate, consigning her to a path that might very well end in death. Yet she fed. Let no fear, not yet. For though her heart beat fast and her hands trembled slightly, her soul song rose within her like a quiet tide, a defiance that she could not speak aloud but that pulsed through every fiber of her being, and she rose from the hall with her chin lifted just enough to keep her dignity intact, even as the world continued to scoff, unaware of the quiet strength that simmered beneath her delicate frame. The journey to Stormhold Citadel began under a moon pale as ash, the carriage wheels rattling over the uneven forest paths, each bump and turn a reminder that she was leaving everything familiar behind. The dense pines pressing close to the carriage like guardians and watchers, the night alive with the scent of pine resin, wet earth, and something metallic that made her pulse hitch, a scent she could not name, but that stirred her senses with a sharp awareness. every shadow along the path seeming to shift and lean closer, as if the forest itself knew the importance of the omega it carried. Inside the carriage, the air was thick with tension, her fingers clutching the edge of the seat, knuckles white, yet her breathing remained measured, silent, controlled, her soul song reaching outward, feeling the ripple of anticipation, fear, and unease from the guards stationed outside, sensing the eyes that followed her every move, and in that moment, a shiver ran down her spine as golden eyes appeared from the darkened tree line, watching her, penetrating her without speaking. The presence of the Alpha King already felt though he had not yet spoken, his power and torment radiating like heat from a furnace, making the night chill in contrast to the warmth of his unseen aura. And she knew without understanding why that this encounter would change everything. The gates of Stormhold rose like jagged teeth, black stone glinting in the moonlight, banners flapping in the icy wind, and the guards, clad in dark armor that reflected little light, flanked the path as the carriage approached, their silent stance reminding her that here, nothing was ordinary, nothing was fee, and that the legends of the Alpha King's roar were no mere tale, but a warning etched in fear itself. When she stepped from the carriage, the chill of the wind bit through her cloak, carrying the scent of iron, wet stone, and something dangerous, intoxicating, a mixture that made her heart pound in a rhythm she had never known before. And though she could not speak, though her lips remained sealed, her soul song hummed and thrummed in response to the presence she felt in the shadowed towers above, a presence that both terrified and captivated her. And then a voice came, deep, resonant, terrifying, yet with a hollow echo that seemed to reach directly into her mind, cutting through the night, commanding, unavoidable, a voice that seemed to vibrate in her chest without sound. Bring her to me. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of storms, of death, of power so absolute that her knees threatened to buckle, yet she did not falter, because inside her, the quiet, unyielding force of her soul, song rose to meet it, a shield, a weapon, a heartbeat, a song that only she could feel and wield, and she took the first step forward into the unknown, knowing that no woman had ever survived the Alpha King's trial. But somehow, deep in the pit of her chest, a defiant whisper of hope dared to bloom, promising that this silent, rejected Omega might be the one to change the course of legend forever. The great obsidian gates of Stormhold Citadel closed behind Liora with a heavy, final clang, reverberating through the night air like a death knell. Yet she did not flinch, her steps measured, her cloak brushing the cold stone floor as she was escorted through the cavernous entryway by silent guards whose eyes never wavered from her form. And though she could not speak, her soul song stretched outward, sensing the unseen currents of tension that coiled like serpents through the halls, sensing fear, suspicion, and awe mingling together, for even the bravest warriors of the Citadel paused to steal a glance at the silent Omega, curious about the one who dared enter the domain of the Thunder King without trembling, and she could feel the echoes of their thoughts like distant waves, whispers of disbelief and murmurs of warning. Yet she kept her head high, aware of the weight of every step she took, knowing that to falter now would mean disaster. And still, her heart pulsed not with terror, but with a strange, electric curiosity about the presence she already sensed, the unseen eyes watching her from above and beyond the shadows, the Alpha King himself, Dorian, a man whose power and torment had become the stuff of legend, whose roar was said to rip mountains asunder, whose gaze alone could fracture the will of the strongest woman, yet whose aura, she felt it even now, was laced with an aching loneliness that resonated with the quiet rhythms of her own soul song. As she passed through the echoing halls, tapestries depicting the Citadel's dark history and murals of the Thunder King in battle loomed over her, the scent of polished stone, iron, and burning torches mixing with the faint tang of something sweet, an intoxicating scent that drew her attention and stirred something deep within her, a curiosity she could not name, and she realized, with a shiver that traveled down her spine, that these halls had never been walked by anyone like her, a silent Omega who could feel the unspoken emotions of those around her, who could sense the hidden fears and desires of a kingdom built on dominance and intimidation. And already the court whispered, some in awe, some in fear, noting the strange light in her eyes and the way her presence seemed to calm the tension around her, like a quiet ripple in a storm-tossed lake. Rumors of Dorian passed through the servants' whispers, hints of his cruelty, his curse, the devastating power of his roar, tales of women who had entered his chamber and never returned, stories of madness and death, yet in the undercurrent. Rent of her soul song, Liora sensed another side, a vulnerability that no tale had dared speak of, a loneliness so raw that it resonated with the quiet ache inside her own chest, a connection she did not yet understand, but could feel like a magnetic pull drawing her toward him. As she was led into the inner courtyards, the moonlight painted the black stone with silver streaks, casting long, jagged shadows across the frozen fountain and the towering walls, the wind whispering through the battlements like voices of those who had fallen, and in the distance, a flicker of golden light, two eyes, bright and piercing, watching her, unseen by the guards, yet unmistakably present, and her soul song quivered in recognition, sensing a storm of emotions, rage, sorrow, longing, and something else, something softer, almost hesitant, almost curious, and it sent an unfamiliar thrill shivering along her spine. She paused, just a moment, allowing herself to feel the tension in the air, the weight of every whisper and glance, and in that heartbeat, she understood that Dorian had already noticed her, that her arrival, her defiance, her silence, had cut through the layers of fear and obedience that shielded him from the world, and though he remained hidden, unseen by mortal eyes, she could feel the intensity of his scrutiny, sharp and electric, like a blade dancing at the edge of her awareness. The palace staff hurried past her, faces pale and bowed, whispering warnings of his temperament, of the countless women who had failed before. Yet in Liora, none of these fears rooted themselves, because her silence was not weakness, and her soul song gave her strength, a force unseen yet tangible, allowing her to move with a quiet authority that unsettled the courtiers and guards alike. As she approached the inner chamber doors, a low hum of energy vibrated beneath her feet, the stone itself resonating with the Alpha's presence, a pressure that seemed to press against her ribs yet did not suffocate her, and she understood, instinctively, that she was not merely entering a trial of survival, but a trial of understanding, of empathy, of connection, and somewhere in the depths of Stormhold Citadel, Dorian sensed the same pull, the stirring of something unusual, something that made him pause mid-step in the shadows, his golden eyes narrowing, captivated by the silent Omega who dared to enter his domain without flinching, without trembling, whose presence tugged at some long-buried corner of his heart he had not allowed to awaken in decades. Whispers from the court reached her ears, some mocking, some reverent, and yet she ignored them, allowing her soul song to stretch outward, brushing the emotions around her, calming tension, easing suspicion, and even in the flickering torchlight, she sensed Dorian's focus tightening, sensing her courage, her empathy, her defiance, and the tiniest spark of recognition that perhaps she was unlike any woman who had come before, that perhaps she could survive, not through fear or submission, but through understanding, through presence, through the quiet strength of her silent heart. The guards led her through endless corridors, arches, and spiral staircases, every step heightening the tension, every glance she could feel like a heartbeat reverberating in her chest, every shadow a possible witness to the storm that was coming, and she sensed eyes watching her from every balcony, every turret, every darkened alcove, and though no one spoke, the weight of anticipation was almost suffocating, a tangible pulse in the air, as if the citadel itself held its breath, waiting for what would unfold when she finally came face to face with the Thunder King. And then, in a private corridor, dimly lit by sconces, she felt it fully, the pull of his presence closer now, impossible to ignore, a tidal wave of emotion that swept through her body and rattled the foundations of her mind, anger and sorrow, and a loneliness so profound it echoed the emptiness she had carried all her life, and yet there was curiosity, intrigue, a dangerous spark that made her pulse race and her heart ache with a feeling she did not yet understand, a connection that bridged the distance between them before they had spoken, before they had touched, a silent thread pulling her toward him and him toward her, neither fully aware of the other, yet the pull undeniable. The guards halted, placing her before the final double doors of polished black stone, carved with runes and sigils that thrummed faintly under her fingers, the air thick with the scent of iron, pine, and something indefinably sweet, intoxicating, and she knew that behind those doors, Dorian waited, unseen but present, watching, sensing, judging, and already intrigued by the one rejected Omega who did not tremble, who did not flee, whose soul song reached for him even without intention. Liora swallowed the tightening in her throat, her hands clasped in front of her, fingers brushing her cloak as the torchlight danced across her pale skin, and in the silence before the doors, the world seemed to shrink until it was only her, the unseen Alpha, and the storm that was about to erupt between them. And as the shadows deepened, as her heartbeat raced in tandem with the echo of the unseen presence, she took the first step forward, knowing the trial was coming, knowing no woman had ever survived, yet feeling for the first time that survival might not be enough, that understanding, empathy, and perhaps something more could change the fate written for her, that in the eyes she had not yet seen, in the golden gaze that burned into her soul even now, she might discover not just terror but connection, not just danger but destiny. And in that moment, the silence of the rejected Omega became a force, a promise, a defiance that even the Thunder King could not ignore. The tension coiled Tiamat, Eider, a storm waiting to break. And as the doors creaked open ever so slightly, a single golden eye appeared from the darkness beyond, meeting her gaze, and her soul. Song shivered with recognition, excitement and fear all at once, and she realized, even without words, that the Alpha had seen her, that he had felt her, and that the trial was no longer simply a test of courage. It was a collision of two souls destined to intertwine, a spark igniting in the darkness, a dangerous, thrilling prelude to everything yet to come. The great hall of Stormhold Citadel stretched before Liora like a cathedral of power and intimidation, torchlight flickering across black stone walls, banners fluttering with the insignia of the Thunder King, and a crowd of nobles, knights, and courtiers packed tightly together, murmuring in anticipation as though the very air trembled with the memory of countless women who had come before and failed. And she stepped forward quietly, her cloak brushing the cold marble floor, her hands folded in front of her, every nerve alert, her soul's song extending outward like invisible threads, feeling the currents of fear, curiosity, and malice that swirled around her, tasting the tension in the air like iron on her tongue. And though she could not speak, her pulse echoed her resolve, steady yet fast, a rhythm that matched the unspoken heartbeat of the hall itself, for every whisper of her arrival, every sideways glance, every tightened jaw and narrowed eye was a thread she could feel, a map of emotion and intent laid bare before her as she navigated the crowd. Nobles in gowns of silk and velvet, faces painted with judgment and expectation, turned their attention to the silent Omega who dared to stand where no woman had ever survived. And it was Lord Valen himself, the man who had humiliated her before, who rose with a dramatic flourish, his voice carrying like a whip across the hall, drawing laughter from those who had gathered to witness the trial. Ah, the silent shadow returns. Tell me, Omega, did your parents whisper courage into you, or did they leave? You to your fate, as usual? His words landed like blows, ricocheting through the air, yet Leora's shoulders remained straight, her gaze lowered, her soul song rippling outward, feeling the venom and amusement around her, absorbing it, understanding it, transforming it into a quiet defiance that stirred the whispers into a current of tension, a force that unsettled the very courtiers who had laughed. Celine, perched near the front with her icy smile and perfectly calculated posture, clutched a silk handkerchief, pretending to dab at tears she did not feel, her eyes gleaming with malicious delight as she whispered to the nobles beside her, weaving the tale of Liora's inadequacy, her muteness, her uselessness, and each word fed the storm of judgment in the hall. Yet Leora's heart remained steady, her soul song humming like a hidden shield, sensing the hidden doubts, the secret admiration she could coax from those who believed her weak, threads of emotion she could manipulate without uttering a single syllable. The music of the event swelled, violins and flutes blending with the hum of conversations, the scent of burning candles mingling with roasted meats and cold stone, the atmosphere intoxicating and suffocating all at once, and Liora moved through it like a shadow, aware of every brush of silk, every nervous glance, every whispered curse, the tension building around her like an invisible cage, tightening with every heartbeat, every eye upon her, every expectation that she would falter. She could feel Dorian before she saw him, a presence unlike any other, watching from the upper balcony, where the throne room rose like a dark sanctuary, and his attention was magnetic, inescapable, drawing her despite the fear she did not allow herself to acknowledge, a force she could feel in her bones, even as the nobles mocked and jeered, even as Lord Valen's tongue lashed with cruel words, even as Celine's smile gleamed sharp and wicked. A courtier whispered behind her back, "The Omega will break before the trial even begins," and she felt the fear of the words, the intent to wound, the small shiver of anticipation they carried, and yet, inside her, a different pulse answered, a quiet, defiant rhythm that rose and strengthened, her soul song resonating outward in subtle waves that tugged at the emotions of those nearby, leaving a fraction of doubt, a seed of admiration, even in those who intended her harm. And then it happened, the moment that would etch itself into the memory of every witness, as Lord Valen leaned forward, mocking her with a hand raised like a blade. She lifted her chin, her eyes meeting the space above him, and though no words passed her lips, her presence struck like a silent command, a current of calm authority that rippled outward and made the laughter falter for the first time. A subtle tremor in the confidence of those who had come to watch her fail, and somewhere in the upper balcony, the golden eyes of Dorian narrowed, a faint, almost imperceptible tilt of his head, acknowledging the courage and quiet strength radiating from the rejected Omega who refused to break under scrutiny. And for the first time in the long history of the Citadel, he felt a flicker of curiosity, a spark that unsettled the storm inside him, that drew him closer without movement, a pull in his chest he could not explain. Whispers spread through the hall like wildfire, some in awe, some in fear. She does not quiver. She does not cry. She stands like a shadow in the storm. And with every whispered word, Leora's confidence grew, a quiet crescendo that wrapped around her like armor, her soul song thrumming in tandem with her heartbeat, weaving through the crowd, brushing against anger, amusement, jealousy, and fear alike, bending emotions subtly, shaping perception without her intending, and the nobles who had mocked her before now felt the prick of uncertainty, the flicker of hesitation, the faintest unease that the Omega before Tiu Hem might not only survive, but alter the very balance of power. Celine's smile faltered as she sensed the change, the subtle shift in attention, in tension, in energy that Liora radiated without sound, and her whispers of triumph to Lord Valen went unanswered, as even he began to notice, however unconsciously, the aura of strength surrounding the silent Omega, the defiance that did not shout but resonated, that touched minds without words, that made even the bravest courtiers pause. And for the first time, a ripple of apprehension ran through the assembly, an awareness that this trial would be unlike any before. The music swelled, the torches flickered, shadows danced across the polished stone, and Liora moved toward the center of the hall, each step deliberate, measured, yet imbued with a quiet power that radiated without sound. And though the nobles murmured, though the guards watched tensely, though Lord Valen's sneer remained, unshaken outwardly, she felt the eyes of Dorian, unseen but undeniable, piercing her very soul, sensing her courage, sensing her empathy, sensing the defiance that had always lived inside her, and now blazed quietly for all to feel. And though she could not know it yet, that single step, taken without fear, without hesitation, without the need for words, had set the stage for a confrontation that would challenge legends, shatter expectations, and awaken a connection that neither of them had anticipated. A collision of strength and silence, of rage and empathy, of destiny and desire that would echo through the halls of Stormhold Citadel for decades to come. The nobles leaned in, the whispers grew, the tension thickened, and though Liora could not speak, the air itself seemed to shift around her, bending to the power of her quiet defiance, until at last, from the shadows above, the golden eyes met hers, a spark of recognition passing between he Alpha King and the rejected Omega, and in that instant, the crowd, the torches, the banners, the stone walls, and every whispering noble faded to nothing, leaving only the silent bond forming in the space between them, fragile yet undeniable, a pulse of connection that promised fire, storm, and transformation. And as the first act of mockery concluded and Lord Valen stepped back, uncertain for the first time, Liora felt the thrill of impending destiny, the surge of power in her silence, and the quiet certainty that no woman who had come before could claim her strength, that no voice could rival her soul song, and that the trial, though meant to break her, might just reveal the true force within the rejected Omega who faced the Alpha King with unwavering courage and a heart unbound. The hall held its breath, the torches flickered one last time, the whispers ceased for a heartbeat, and Leora's soul song thrummed like the first note of a symphony yet to be played, a quiet, unstoppable wave that promised that everything about Stormhold Citadel, about Dorian, and about the legend of the Thunder King was about to change forever, for she was no longer merely a shadow. She was the spark, the silent force, the Omega who refused to bow, and the Alpha King's eyes had already found her, and in that finding, the storm had begun. The corridors of Stormhold Citadel twisted and spiraled like the coils of a serpent, dimly lit by flickering sconces whose flames cast wavering shadows across the polished obsidian stone, and Liora moved silently through them, each step measured, her cloak whispering against the cold floor as though the walls themselves held their breath, waiting, watching, carrying the tension of the court still lingering from the morning's humiliation, the echoes of noble laughter, the sting of Lord Valen's words, and yet within her, a quiet calm persisted, her soul song weaving threads of reassurance around her, sensing the emotions in the walls, the flicker of apprehension from the guards, the faint curiosity of unseen courtiers, and the pull of something unseen, something golden, that thrummed in her chest like a warning and a promise all at once. She paused at the base of a grand staircase, the air thick with the scent of cold stone, burning torches, and something intangible, sweet and metallic, a mixture that made her pulse hitch, her fingers tightening around the edges of her shawl, and she knew before she saw him that the Alpha King was near, that he had sensed her strength, her courage, her defiance, that he had watched her silently, unseen yet ever present, and now he was moving closer, a presence she could feel before it manifested, a wave of heat, power, and restrained emotion pressing against the walls, threading through the corridors, vibrating along the floors, through the very stone beneath her feet, and she did not flinch, did not retreat, because though she felt the storm approaching, her soul song hummed in rhythm with her heartbeat, steady, fearless, ready. And then, as if the shadows themselves parted in respect, he appeared, tall, regal, a figure carved from obsidian and gold, his presence overwhelming yet oddly restrained, the golden eyes she had felt for nights finally meeting hers in the dim light, and in that gaze, 1,000 unspoken words passed between them, a storm of curiosity, judgment, rage, and something softer, something that made the air around her shiver with unacknowledged longing. And though his lips remained sealed, his posture rigid with command, every line of his body radiated power, control, and a faint vulnerability she could sense through the invisible threads of his emotions, a vulnerability no one had ever survived to see. And yet here it was, laid bare before her silent heart song. He stepped closer, deliberate and slow, his boots echoing against the stone in a rhythm that matched her own pulse, and though he said nothing, the tension in the air was suffocating, a tangible cue, rent of command and curiosity. And when he stopped just a few feet from her, she felt the warmth radiating off him, the subtle trembling of restrained energy, and the faintest quiver of unspoken longing. And she could not help but notice the small details, how the flickering torchlight caught the sharp angles of his face, how his eyes, molten and golden, seemed to see everything and nothing at once, how the air itself seemed to bend around him, charged with anticipation, threat, and something dangerously intimate. "You are different," he said finally, his voice low, measured, barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of storms. And though the words were few, they struck her like lightning, reverberating in her chest, stirring her soul song, awakening threads of energy that had long lain dormant. And she realized in that instant that he was testing her, not with threats, not with anger, but with perception, with attention, with the power to see her in ways no one else could. And she met his gaze, steady, unwavering, her own pulse threading through the invisible music that hummed between them, a silent declaration of presence, defiance, and curiosity. He tilted his head, studying her, his eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing her soul, tracing her every thought through the delicate threads of empathy he could feel. And for the first time, a flicker of hesitation crossed his otherwise commanding expression, a crack in the armor that no one but the Omega before him could sense. And in that crack, she felt possibility, danger, and the faintest whisper of connection that made her chest tighten and her pulse quicken. Though no sound passed her lips, the silence stretched between them, heavy, charged, electric, the air vibrating with tension, and Liora sensed that this moment, though brief, held the potential to change everything, that the trial was no longer merely a test of survival, but the first act of something far greater, far more dangerous, and far more intimate than she had ever imagined, and she let her soul song hum in response, a subtle, invisible melody that brushed against him, teasing, probing, feeling, stirring recognition, and perhaps the tiniest hint of longing, a song that spoke without words, that revealed defiance and courage and quiet strength, and she could sense him responding, constraining himself, restraining the urge to move closer, to speak, to shatter the silence with words that might betray the storm within him. A door creaked in the distance, a servant shuffled past, and the spell of the moment threatened to break, yet neither moved, neither blinked. The room suspended in anticipation, a fragile bubble of connection in the vast citadel, and for the first time, Dorian allowed himself a fraction of curiosity, a taste of intrigue, a fleeting acknowledgement of the Omega who did not fear him, who did not flinch, whose silent presence had pierced the storm of his life and drawn him to her without reason, without ceremony, without declaration, simply through the power of being, and he could not look away. "Be ready," he said finally, the words low, deliberate, loaded with unspoken meaning, a promise and a warning intertwined, a thread of command and curiosity that settled over her like a cloak. And though it was brief, it made her pulse race, her soul song hum with anticipation, and though she did not speak, the weight of those words pressed into her chest like a challenge she could not ignore, a challenge she had never imagined but was instinctively prepared to meet. And in that single moment, She knew the trial would be unlike anything she had anticipated, that her survival depended not merely on courage, but on understanding, empathy, and the unspoken bond forming between them, fragile, dangerous, and utterly consuming. He stepped back, his eyes lingering a fraction longer than necessary. A silent acknowledgement, a spark of intrigue that made her chest ache and her soul song vibrate, and without a no, their word, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving her alone with the weight of anticipation, the echo of his presence still thrumming through the halls, the tension thick and palpable. And she realized that this first contact, brief as it was, had changed everything, that the Alpha King had seen her, had acknowledged her, and that no matter what trials awaited, no matter the mockery, the danger, or the fire of the court, she had made an impression, carved a place in the storm of his life, and awakened a curiosity and connection that neither of them could ignore. The corridors seemed colder after his departure, the shadows deeper, the torches flickering uncertainly, as if aware of the tension that lingered. Yet she felt a quiet thrill, a surge of possibility, a recognition of power she had never dared hope for. And as she walked alone through the halls, her heart beating in rhythm with her invisible song, she understood that this was only the beginning, that the trial, the court, and the Alpha himself were now inextricably linked to her fate, and that the first spark had been struck, a spark that promised fire, storm, and a connection that would burn brighter than any roar, louder than any word, and deeper than any fear. A spark that neither time, nor court, nor curse could extinguish, for she was the rejected Omega, and the Alpha King had seen her, had acknowledged her, and in that acknowledgement, the game had begun. The inner chambers of Stormhold Citadel were quiet, almost unnaturally so, the torches along the walls casting long, wavering shadows across the polished obsidian floors. And Liora moved carefully, her fingers brushing against the stone as though grounding herself, feeling the pulse of the citadel beneath her, the silent hum of power that threaded through its walls like a living entity, sensing the tension that lingered from the court and the lingering presence of the Alpha King, whose gaze still haunted her from the balconies above, his golden eyes burning in her memory, a fire and a warning, a storm and a promise all at once. And she ivored slightly despite herself, her soul song quivering in resonance with the emotions she could sense in the air, the anticipation, the fear, the awe, the curiosity, and a strange, thrilling intimacy she did not yet understand, but could feel tugging at her very essence. The hallway opened into a secluded chamber, a small balcony overlooking the storm-lashed walls of the outer courtyard, and the scent of wet stone, iron, and rain mingled with the faint traces of lavender from the chamber, and it was here, alone for the first time, that she felt his presence fully. A golden shadow among the torches, a weight and warmth pressing into the air around her, and though he remained at the far end of the chamber, she sensed him measuring her, assessing her, feeling her courage, her empathy, the subtle power of her soul song that had drawn him in even before she spoke, even before she moved. And for the first time, the Alpha King of Stormhold Citadel did not feel like a distant storm, but a man standing before her, breathing, human, flawed, and achingly vulnerable in ways no one else had ever seen. "You have a gift," he said, his voice low, almost reverent, carrying across the space between them like a ripple of gravity, and though it was a simple statement, it resonated with weight, a recognition that made her chest tighten, her soul song responding, a gentle pulse, a quiet affirmation, and she realized that for the first time, she was being seen, truly seen, not as an Omega to be dismissed or mocked, but as a person whose very presence could influence the man before her, whose silent heart could reach him where words had failed, where authority had failed, where power alone had never touched. She stepped forward, slow and deliberate, feeling the pull of the space between them, the tension coiling and uncoiling like a living thing, sensing the golden gaze of Dorian following tracing her movements, studying her, reading the unspoken rhythms of her heartbeat and the subtle shifts of emotion that her soul song bled into the air, and in that moment, she allowed herself a brief, almost imperceptible smile, a silent gesture of acknowledgement, of connection, and she felt him exhale. A sound almost inaudible yet vibrating in the stone around them, a shiver of recognition, of curiosity, of something deeper, more dangerous than either had anticipated. He moved closer, each step deliberate, measured, a predator and a man bound by restraint, and she could feel the warmth of him in waves, the subtle vibrations of power that emanated from his presence, the tension coiled tightly in the space between them, almost unbearable. And yet she did not step back, did not falter, for within her, the quiet strength of her soul song hummed like armor, like a river of calm, carrying defiance, empathy, and curiosity in perfect rhythm, and she allowed the threads of it to stretch toward him, brushing against the storm in his chest, probing, touching, weaving subtle currents of trust and fascination into the invisible connection forming between them. "Show me," he said, golden eyes intent, voice barely above a whisper, but weighted with command. And though the request was vague, it carried an unspoken challenge, a demand for honesty, vulnerability, and courage. And Leora's heart thudded, not with fear, but with the thrill of recognition, the exhilaration of being asked to reveal herself, to lift the veil she had hidden behind all her life, and without hesitation, she lifted her sleeve slightly, revealing a faint scar along her wrist, a remnant of a childhood accident, a mark of fragility she had long tried to hide. And in that small act, she offered him a fragment of trust, a piece of the silent story she had carried alone for years. Dorian's eyes softened imperceptibly, the hardness of command and legend faltering as he studied the mark, tracing it with unspoken questions, reading the story of pain, resilience, and courage that lay hidden beneath her skin, A.E. And though he said nothing, she felt the shift, the subtle movement in the air, the tension uncoiling slightly as he reached a hand closer, stopping just short of touching her, a measure of restraint and reverence that made her pulse quicken, her soul song thrumming with response, a quiet melody threading between them, unspoken yet profound, a connection deeper than words, a bond forming in silence, fragile yet undeniable. "You feel everything," he said finally, voice husky, almost confessional. And though it was a statement, it carried the weight of revelation, a recognition of her gift, her power, the influence of her soul song that had drawn him into this moment, into this intimacy without touch or word. And she nodded subtly, allowing the invisible music of her presence to reach him, to wrap around the storm inside him, to calm, to intrigue, to bind. And in the silence that followed, they shared more than conversation could convey, an understanding of pain and isolation, of longing and restraint, of strength born in quiet and empathy born in shadow. And the air between them vibrated with a mixture of anticipation, tension, and an unacknowledged longing that neither dared speak aloud. The distant sounds of the citadel, the echoing footsteps of guards, the murmurs of courtiers, faded into nothing as the invisible tether of their connection drew taut, a silent heartbeat threading them together, a spark that promised fire, danger, and intimacy all at once. And for the first time, Liora sensed that she was no longer merely a guest, no longer merely an omega to be tested, but an essential force in the storm of Dorian's life, a presence he could not ignore, a soul he could not dismiss. A sudden gust of wind from the open balcony fluttered her cloak, carrying the scent of rain, wet stone, and something intoxicating, metallic and wild, and she shivered despite herself, not from cold, but from the raw pull of his attention, the golden gaze that burned into her very being, and for the first time she allowed herself to hope, to imagine, that this trial, this encounter, might not end in failure or destruction, that perhaps it could lead to something extraordinary, something dangerous, something irreversible. He stepped closer still, the faintest vibration of air announcing his movement, and she felt the pulse of him, the rhythm of command and restraint, the subtle storm barely contained in his presence. And though they were still separated by distance, the invisible threads of soul song wrapped tighter, a coil of anticipation, desire, and curiosity, binding them in a silent dialogue that neither could yet name. And as his eyes flickered, the storm in them momentarily softened, a glance that spoke of loneliness, of longing, of the faintest hope that someone, finally, could understand him. The chamber seemed to shrink around them, the flickering torchlight casting shadows that danced across their faces. The air charged with unspoken tension, every heartbeat echoing between them, every breath a note in the symphony of their silent connection. And though no hand touched, though no words passed, the intimacy of the moment was undeniable, a collision of defiance and vulnerability, strength and empathy, courage and curiosity, and Liora realized that this first private encounter had shifted something fundamental, that the Alpha King was no longer untouchable, no longer unknowable, that he had seen her, truly seen her, and that she had glimpsed him, truly glimpsed the man behind the legend, and that spark, that invisible thread, was now a wildfire waiting to ignite. A sudden creak from the outer door reminded them both of the world beyond, the trial, the court, the spies and rivals. Yet in that moment, time seemed suspended. The storm paused, the world held its breath, and though Dorian retreated slightly, his golden gaze remained locked on her, a promise unspoken yet undeniable, and she felt the pull, the tether, the invisible melody that bow on them together, and she knew, in the marrow of her bones, that nothing would ever be the same, that the trial, the court, and the legend of the Thunder King were now intertwined with her fate, and that the rejected Omega had begun to weave her own destiny alongside the Alpha whose storm she had dared to face, a connection forged in silence, empathy, and the unspoken truths that would shape the kingdom, their hearts, and the fire that was yet to come. The Citadel's grand hall, once echoing with curiosity and hushed admiration for the silent Omega, now bristled with hostility, the tension palpable as nobles whispered behind fans and silk sleeves, their eyes sharp with suspicion and delight at potential scandal, and Liora moved through the corridors, her steps quiet, measured, aware that every glance, every murmured word could carry the seeds of ruin. For Malric and Vela had begun their quiet machinations, their ambitions simmering beneath polite smiles, each gesture calculated to ensnare her, each glance a trap cloaked in civility, and she could feel the invisible threads of deceit winding around the hall like serpents, tasting the bitterness in the air, the metallic tang of fear, and sensing the unspoken delight of those who believed she could be undone without uttering a single word. Yet her soul song remained a steady undercurrent, rippling outward to steady herself, to observe, to sense where the danger lay, the subtle shifts in posture, the hidden glances, the micro-expressions that told her where Malric had poisoned minds, where Vela had seeded doubt, and where Celine's cruel satisfaction fed the gathering storm. The morning ceremony, intended as a mere formality before the official trial, became a stage for treachery, the nobles seated in rows like predators circling prey, their whispers swelling into a chorus of accusation and rumor as Malric stood suddenly, clearing his throat with exaggerated formality, eyes glinting as he pointed a carefully polished finger in Leora's direction, his voice carrying through the hall with the calm authority of Ane, presenting undeniable proof. The Omega before us, though silent, has been observed using forbidden arts, weaving her soul song to manipulate minds, a dangerous power unfit for the court and unworthy of the king's favor, and the words landed like hammers, echoing against the stone, reverberating in the ears of all present, twisting the tension into something suffocating, a pressure that threatened to crush her resolve, while Vela, standing nearby with her hands clasped delicately, nodded and smiled, her eyes sharp and calculating, a gleam of triumph that Liora could feel as if the walls themselves were vibrating with malice. Murmurs erupted, noble ladies gasping, men leaning forward in judgment, the air thick with suspicion, and Leora's pulse raced, yet her expression remained calm, composed, the faintest quiver of her breath hidden beneath a serene mask. Her soul song unfurling subtly, brushing against the crowd, probing, sensing, deflecting the intent to wound, bending perception with the quiet power that had already drawn Dorian's attention, a silent shield she could weave even as accusation after accusation threatened to drown her in shame. Celine, perched near the front with her icy, satisfied smile, leaned toward a cluster of nobles, whispering venomous tales of Leora's inadequacy, fabricating incidents of manipulation and recklessness, painting her as a threat to the order of the Citadel. Yet Liora sensed the faltering confidence in those around her, the flickers of doubt, hesitation, and intrigue she had seeded in the halls before, threads her soul song now strengthened and wove into a delicate lattice of subtle influence, planting questions where certainty had been, hesitation where cruelty had reigned, and admiration where fear had thrived. And though the crowd believed they were united against her, she could feel the imperceptible shifts in loyalty, the sea. Subtle protective currents of knights like Arendor, who lingered in the shadows, watching, ready, waiting, hearts attuned to hers and sensing danger before it could strike. Just as Malric's accusation reached its crescendo, Dorian appeared, moving through the hall with a predator's grace, every step commanding attention, the golden eyes sharp and piercing, and though he said nothing initially, the subtle vibration of power radiating from him silenced the murmurs, bending the tension in the air, drawing the focus to him, and then, more importantly, to her, the Omega who had dared to stand amidst the storm of courtly treachery. And as he approached, the crowd felt the shift, a collective inhale, the sensation that the unseen king was about to make a choice that would change everything. Yet the intrigue remained, the danger unresolved, the threads of conspiracy taut and threatening to snap at any misstep. Vela's lips tightened, Malric's hands clenched subtly, and Celine's smile faltered for a heartbeat, sensing the storm about to break, while Liora, despite the fear that prickled at her senses, felt her soul song pulse in rhythm with the golden gaze that pinned her, a silent dialogue of defiance, courage, and emerging connection, and she understood, with a clarity that cut through the fear, that this was the true test, the moment where power, loyalty, perception, and heart would collide. That survival meant not only facing the accusation, but turning it into a revelation of strength, empathy, and silent mastery. Dorian's eyes swept the hall, settling briefly on each conspirator, and though he did not speak, the weight of his presence commanded attention, bending the crowd to a fragile quiet, an acknowledgement that he alone held the balance between ruin and redemption, and Liora felt the pull, the tether, the invisible symphony of soul song and golden gaze weaving around a connection charged with anticipation, fear, and something dangerously intimate, and she stepped forward, slow, deliberate, aware that every motion was being watched, every subtle shift dissected. Yet with each step, her soul song hummed stronger, brushing against the hostility, deflecting malice, and probing the hearts of those who sought to harm her. Her quiet strength radiating in waves, a storm disguised as serenity, invisible yet undeniable, and the nobles felt it, even if they could not name it. A guard shifted nervously, whispering warnings to his neighbor. The council murmured among themselves, questioning the validity of Malric's claims, and for the first time, doubt crept into the confidence of those who had sought her downfall, a subtle tremor that Liora could feel and harness, the delicate power of perception, empathy, and silent presence bending the tide, while Dorian's gaze never wavered, locking on her with a promise that spoke without words, a promise of protection, interest, and an unspoken warning to those who dared harm her. A candle flickered, the shadows danced, and the tension was a living thing, coiling around the hall, waiting for a single misstep. Yet Liora stood unmoving, the calm epicenter of a gathering storm, her silent power threading through the fear, doubt, and curiosity of the assembly, until finally, with a barely perceptible motion of his hand, Dorian signaled to the council, a subtle command that turned the tide, a declaration that, though she faced threats, the Alpha King had noticed, had chosen, and that no scheme, no accusation, no whisper of treachery could break the invisible bond forming between them. And in that moment, Liora understood that her trial was not merely survival, but mastery of perception, empathy, and courage, that the rejected Omega had begun to shape destiny in the Citadel, and that the storm of intrigue and danger had only just begun, with Dorian's gaze and silent presence as both shield and fire, a promise of trials yet to come, and a warning to those who dared challenge her. The hall fell into a tense silence, every whisper stilled, every malicious smile faltering, and Liora felt a quiet thrill, her soul song humming with anticipation, a subtle symphony of courage, warning, and desire that reached the Alpha, threading their hearts together even in the midst of danger. And as the conspirators recoiled, plotting anew, she knew the battle was only beginning. But the bond, invisible yet undeniable, had been forged, and the rejected Omega would no longer be underestimated. The great hall of Stormhold Citadel, already heavy with tension, became a living entity of suspense and fear as whispers transformed into murmurs of outrage, the nobles leaning forward like predators sensing a shift in the hunt, and Liora stood at the center, silent yet radiant, her soul song unfurling like invisible banners in the air, sensing every heartbeat, every quiver of doubt, every shadowed glance aimed at her with malice. And though Malric's accusations had twisted the room into a storm of suspicion, her calm presence acted like a countercurrent, a quiet tide weaving through the chaos, subtly brushing against the emotions of the crowd, bending the fear and hatred just enough to sow uncertainty in their confidence, while Vela's eyes narrowed, her perfect mask of civility faltering, as she realized the Omega she had sought to destroy was no longer merely standing, but thriving under the weight of scrutiny, a silent storm that refused to break. The candles flickered violently as if sensing the tension, torches casting long, wavering shadows along the obsidian walls, the banners overhead seeming to sway in sympathy with the invisible symphony of power radiating from Liora, and she felt it, the invisible threads of attention, perception, and emotion converging on her, a delicate balance that could tip toward disaster with a single misstep. Yet she stood firm, her pulse steady, her chest rising and falling in rhythm with the invisible melody of courage and defiance she carried, even as Malric's eyes glimmered with calculation, a predator assessing the Omega who had dared to defy the court. Dorian appeared suddenly, emerging from the shadows like a storm incarnate, his golden eyes blazing, every line of his body radiating authority, control, and the unrestrained power of the Alpha, and the hall fell silent, the weight of his presence bending the air, commanding attention and centering focus on him and, more importantly, on Liora, the rejected Omega who had captured not only his gaze, but the threads of his heart and mind, a tether invisible yet unbreakable. And as he approached, the subtle vibration of energy radiating from him made the torches flicker, the shadows dance, and the nobles instinctively step back, sensing both danger and promise. His gaze swept across Malric and Vela, unspoken judgment in every golden glance, a warning as sharp as any blade, and though he said nothing at first, the charge in the room shifted, a collective intake of breath as the storm of authority and power coiled around the Omega, her pulse matching his in rhythm, her soul song thrumming in resonance with the invisible tether connecting them, and she felt it, the surge of trust, protection, and desire that threaded between them, fragile yet undeniable, binding their fates in the midst of chaos. Malric's voice rose, venom-laced and demanding. "Your Majesty, this Omega has endangered the court with forbidden influence. She must be restrained before disaster befalls us all." But Dorian did not respond with words, only with a subtle tilt of his head, a golden glare that carried the weight of judgment, command, and unyielding authority, and the effect was instantaneous. Whispers halted, the council stiffened, and even Vela's perfect composure trembled, as if struck by an invisible hand, her carefully constructed power challenged by the Alpha's unspoken decree. Liora, feeling the invisible shield of his presence, let her soul song flow freely, no longer cautious, weaving a tapestry of emotion that exposed the treachery in the room, brushing against Malric's cunning intent and Vela's jealousy, amplifying their unease while subtly drawing the eyes of the courtiers toward doubt, toward suspicion, toward clarity, and the nobles, sensing something undeniable yet imperceptible, leaned in, murmurs fading into a tense silence, a collective awareness that the Omega they had sought to ruin was not merely innocent, but a force that could not be ignored. And then, in a motion as fluid as lightning, Dorian stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the conspirators, his presence a living wall of authority, his alpha aura radiating power and danger, a warning that any misstep would be met with force. And as he extended a hand toward Liora, a silent invitation to step beside him, she felt the tether snap taut, a surge of electricity in her chest, her soul song resonating in harmony with his power, and in that single moment, the rejected Omega became the pivot of the court, the fulcrum around which judgment, fear, and awe turned, and she moved, silent yet unyielding, stepping into the space beside him, her heart thundering, her spirit aflame with courage, and their invisible connection solidified, a bond felt by all present, radiating authority, unity, and defiance. Malric faltered, his calculated demeanor cracking under the weight of the Alpha's presence and the Omega's silent strength, while Vela's lips parted slightly in shock, Celine's smile freezing into a mask of disbelief, and the council, once eager to condemn, now shifted uneasily, sensing that the Omega's survival and influence were no longer uncertain but inevitable, a force validated by the Alpha King himself. The torches flickered again, shadows dancing across the polished stone, and Liora felt the pulse of the hall, the rhythm of anticipation, danger, and awe, her soul song Inti, intertwining with Dorian's presence, a melody of defiance, protection, and unspoken longing, the invisible threads of connection tangible to both of them, and though no one spoke, the bond broadcasted, authority, unity, and an unbreakable tether of trust that silenced all opposition. Then, finally, Dorian's voice rang out, low and commanding, golden eyes locking on the conspirators. "This ends now. No harm will come to her in my court." And though the words were few, they shattered the fragile confidence of the traitors, echoing through the hall with finality, authority, and a promise of retribution. And Liora felt a rush of relief, excitement, and something tender, thrilling, and dangerous in the depth of her chest as the Alpha King claimed her beside him, not just as a survivor, but as an equal, a mate, a partner whose silent courage had become a force undeniable to all present. The hall exhaled collectively, whispers dying, the conspirators frozen, guards shifting uneasily, and Liora, standing tall beside Dorian, felt her soul song swell with pride, courage, and unspoken love, a wave that wrapped around them, binding them, declaring them united, and as the golden eyes of the Alpha met hers, a silent acknowledgement passed between them, electric, intimate, and irrevocable, a promise of passion, power, and shared destiny. And in that moment, the rejected Omega, once scorned and underestimated, had claimed her place beside the Alpha King. The storm had been stilled, and yet a new one stirred, one that would test courage, love, and loyalty as never before. For the bond formed in crisis was now unbreakable, and the fire between them had only just begun to burn. The aftermath of the storm in the Grand Hall left the Citadel heavy with a strange, almost reverent silence. the nobles and courtiers staring in awe at the rejected Omega who had survived the court's scheming and the Alpha King who had claimed her beside him, the torches flickering and casting long shadows that danced along the obsidian walls like echoes of the battle just past. And Liora moved carefully, still, feeling the thrumming resonance of her soul song mingling with the subtle power radiating from Dorian, a tether invisible yet palpable, wrapping around her chest and threading through every heartbeat, a reminder that she had survived not merely by courage, but by understanding, empathy, and the quiet strength of her presence, the power that had captured the Alpha's attention, challenged the conspirators, and shifted the tides of the court. Dorian remained at her side, a golden sentinel, eyes sweeping the hall with authority and quiet menace, ensuring that no further whispers of treachery could take root, and Liora felt the warmth of his presence wash over her like sunlight through a storm, a contrast to the cold marble and flickering shadows, the reassurance of protection and acknowledgement wrapping her in safety, even as adrenaline still thrummed in her veins. The energy of confrontation lingering like a pulse in the air, a song only they could feel. She noticed the subtle shifts in his posture, the faint softening of his rigid stance, the small exhale that escaped him as if he, too, were allowing himself a moment of relief and quiet pride. And though no one dared speak for a heartbeat, their shared silence conveyed more than words ever could. An intimacy formed in crisis, forged in the fire of danger, and tempered by mutual recognition, understanding, and attraction, each pulse of emotion from her soul, song threading seamlessly into his presence, a symphony only they could hear, a dialogue of heartbeats, breaths, and invisible music that drew them closer even as the hall remained charged with awe and fear. The conspirators, Malric and Vela, lingered frozen, their malice curdled into panic, uncertainty flickering in their eyes as the realization of failure settled in, while Celine's triumphant expression cracked, the mask of satisfaction falling away to reveal worry. And Liora sensed it all, a ripple of fear, calculation, and regret vibrating through the hall like delicate threads she could feel, but not yet manipulate fully, for her power, though immense, had limits, and she needed time to understand the full reach of her soul song. Yet even in that awareness, she felt a thrill, a surge of empowerment, and a deep, rising joy at the undeniable bond forming between herself and the Alpha, who now regarded her not with disdain, curiosity, or fear, but with something deeper, something private, dangerous, and infinitely intimate. Dorian extended a hand subtly, almost imperceptibly, a silent invitation for her to move closer. And though she hesitated only a fraction of a heartbeat, the pull of the tether, the invisible thread of connection, drew her to him, her pulse quickening, her chest tightening with anticipation, and she allowed herself a small, tentative step, closing the distance in silence, their energy merging, her soul song brushing against the raw, golden power of the Alpha, a subtle dance of dominance and trust, restraint and surrender, desire unspoken but felt, a tension that made the air between them hum and crackle with electricity, a symphony of heartbeats, unvoiced words, and invisible threads weaving a bond that was at once fragile and unbreakable. And as they stood side by side, the golden eyes of Dorian fixed on hers, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, intimate and profound, a promise neither dared speak aloud, but both understood, that whatever challenges, conspiracies, or dangers lay ahead, they would face them together, their bond a shield, a weapon, and a tether of hearts. The hall gradually cleared as whispers died down, the court stunned into uneasy admiration, and Liora felt her body relax slightly, the adrenaline ebbing, the soul song pulsing in gentle waves now instead of surging currents, her chest lightening even as the awareness of what had been accomplished and what remained to be faced settled upon her like a mantle of responsibility. Dorian's hand brushed lightly against hers, almost accidental yet deliberate, a fleeting touch that sent shivers up her spine, the invisible music between them humming with resonance, a dialogue of unspoken affection and emerging trust, and she realized for the first time that their bond was no longer merely about survival, trial, or court intrigue, but about recognition, understanding, and the first glimmers of love, tender, forbidden, and wild, yet undeniable in its potency. The Alpha King spoke then, voice low, golden eyes fixed on her. "You are mine to protect." A statement both possessive and protective, carrying weight, authority, and intimacy, and Liora felt her chest tighten with warmth, pride, and something more, a rising tide of emotion that hummed in rhythm with her soul song, a melody only they could hear, threading through the hall, resonating with the stones, the air, and the hearts present, a subtle symphony of connection that defied words. They moved together to the balcony overlooking the storm-lashed courtyards, the rain tapping against stone and iron, the wind tugging at their cloaks, and in the quiet aftermath, standing shoulder to shoulder, Liora allowed herself the first real moment of reflection, the first chance to savor the victory, the first spark of something tender and intimate as the Alpha King's presence enveloped her, a protective heat coiling around her like a living thing. And she felt the bond pulse stronger, the tether between them tightening in silent communication, her soul song and his golden aura blending, merging, resonating, a melody of defiance, courage, and emerging love. Dorian's gaze swept the horizon, eyes scanning the storm beyond the Citadel walls, and though the tempest raged, the wind and rain battering the stone, in that moment a quiet understanding passed between them, a silent promise that whatever storms came, external or internal, political or personal, they would. LD faced them as one, the rejected Omega and the Alpha King, bound not only by survival and trial, but by a connection that defied words, stronger than any roar, deeper than any fear, and infinitely more potent than any courtly scheming. A sudden flicker of movement in the shadows of the balcony drew their attention. A whisper of unease, a subtle reminder that peace in Stormhold Citadel was fleeting, that danger, intrigue, and ambition would return, yet for now, the moment belonged to them, a stolen, intimate interlude of quiet, power, and unspoken longing, the Alpha King's hand brushing hers again, fingertips grazing with electricity, a spark of desire, protection, and connection, and Leora's chest swelled with hope, courage, and the thrilling awareness that this bond, invisible yet unbreakable, was the beginning of something far greater, a story of trust, love, and courage yet to be fully written. And as the wind howled and the rain lashed against the stone, they stood together, silent, hearts beating in tandem, eyes locked, a tether forged in crisis and solidified in connection, and the rejected Omega knew, with a clarity that made her soul song sing, that this was only the beginning, that the trials to come would be more dangerous, the stakes higher, but that together, nothing, not scheming nobles, not curses, not storms, could break them, and as the citadel shivered around them, shadows flickering, whispers of intrigue lingering in the air, Liora and Dorian shared a silent, intimate acknowledgement, a promise of passion, protection, and destiny intertwined, and in that suspended moment, the rejected Omega and the Alpha King allowed themselves the first, unspoken understanding of what their bond could become, a melody of hearts, courage, and love ready to ignite. The tension in Stormhold Citadel had reached a fever pitch, the grand hall once again filled with nobles, guards, and courtiers, whose whispers hummed like a living thing, coiling around Liora as she stepped forward, her cloak brushing the polished obsidian floors, the subtle scent of lavender and rain, linging to her, and every eye was on her. Curiosity, fear, and lingering doubt shimmering in their gazes, but she moved with a quiet grace, each step measured, deliberate, a symphony of confidence and latent power, her soul song thrumming in soft, resonant pulses that reached out invisibly, sensing the intent, the malice, the ambition in every heart, probing, weaving, influencing without a word. A silent melody that vibrated through the hall, threading anticipation, tension, and the faintest hints of awe into the court. And she felt the subtle reassurance of Dorian beside her, his golden presence radiating authority, protection, and quiet fire. A tether she could sense even without touch, a pulse of warmth, command, and shared resolve that strengthened her own courage as she faced the growing storm of intrigue. The conspirators who had been emboldened by prior chaos now gathered, Vela's icy smile tight, Malric's eyes glinting with poison, Celine's pride twisting into frustrated fury, each one calculating, waiting for a single misstep, a falter that would undo the delicate thread of her influence. And yet, Liora stood tall, the rhythm of her soul song steadying, expanding, probing deeper into the emotions around her, catching the tremors of fear and ambition alike, weaving them into a tapestry she could subtly manipulate, revealing cracks, hesitation, doubt, and the faintest shimmer of truth beneath the facades of control and malice. The council murmured uneasily, guards shifting in their armor, sensing that the Omega before them was no longer merely a target or a pawn, but a force capable of bending perception, even subtly, challenging authority in ways that made hearts quicken and pulses race. And as she walked, the torches flickered, shadows dancing along the walls, painting her in a light both ethereal and commanding, golden eyes glinting from the alpha beside her. A silent shield and partner, a presence that made her pulse thrum with both courage and forbidden thrill, their tether electric, a silent dialogue threading through the tension, anticipation, and danger that now charged the room. Malric stepped forward, hands raised in false civility, voice smooth as silk yet laced with venom. "Your Majesty, this Omega's influence grows unchecked, her power a threat to the order of this court." And though the words were carefully measured to provoke panic, uncertainty, and fear, Leora's soul song rippled outward, gentle yet undeniable, brushing against the hidden hearts of the council, subtly highlighting their loyalty, their doubt, their hidden curiosity, a quiet but unbreakable symphony of influence that began to unravel the carefully spun threads of Malric's scheme, while Dorian's golden gaze never left her, a constant pulse of protection, dominance, and growing, unspoken desire, a tether she could feel tightening with each silent note of her song. The hall seemed to hold its breath as Liora allowed herself the first conscious push of her ability, the silent projection of truth and emotion, a wave that brushed against the minds of those gathered, revealing hidden intent, uncovering lies, exposing subtle betrayals, a silent flood that Malric had not anticipated, and as gasps rippled through the room, eyes widening in shock, a murmur rising like wind through the torches, the conspirators faltered, their perfectly calculated facades cracking under the invisible light of exposure, and Celine's triumphant mask of cruelty slipped, Vela's poise shattered, Malric's carefully measured confidence collapsing in an instant, while the council leaned in, realizing, sensing the undeniable power and truth in the presence of the rejected Omega standing before them. Dorian's hand brushed against hers, subtle but grounding, a surge of warmth, strength, and intimate connection that rippled through her, amplifying the melody of her soul song, a silent symphony of partnership, trust, and undeniable attraction that bound them together. And as he stepped slightly forward, golden aura flaring, the entire hall became attuned to the Alpha's presence, a wall of power that bent attention, judgment, and focus to him and, crucially, to Liora, the Omega whose courage and skill had proven not just survival, but mastery in the face of betrayal, deceit, and danger, a test that had revealed the depth of her strength, her intelligence, and the latent fire in her heart. Malric attempted one final calculated move, a poisoned whisper meant to sway the council against her. But Liora, sensing the surge of malice before it could land, allowed her soul song to extend, weaving clarity, truth, and undeniable emotion into the invisible currents of the room, projecting not arrogance or defiance, but certainty, courage, and the undeniable bond she shared with the Alpha. A silent declaration that any harm or manipulation would not go unnoticed, and the subtle electricity between them amplified, a tether that made the conspirators shiver, faltering in the face of combined power, empathy, and authority. Dorian's voice then rang out, low, commanding, golden eyes blazing. Enough! No treachery will succeed under my watch, and none shall harm the Omega who stands with me. And though few words were spoken, the hall vibrated with their combined presence, an invisible harmony of authority and power, of courage and loyalty. And Liora felt the tether between them surge, the invisible threads of soul song and golden aura intertwining, electric, intimate, and unbreakable, a melody of defiance, love, and recognition that resonated through stone, torchlight, and hearts alike. And then, as the final threads of deceit unraveled before the council, the conspirators frozen and exposed, Liora allowed herself the first conscious acknowledgement of the bond forming between her and Dorian. A subtle glance, a shared breath, a pulse of desire, protection, and recognition that no one else could witness, but that tethered their hearts irrevocably, a silent victory, a first true claim of trust, partnership, and unspoken love, the rejected Omega now not. Just a survivor, but a force, a queen in waiting, a partner whose courage, empathy, and soul song had not only revealed treachery, but cemented her place beside the Alpha King, whose gaze burned with pride, desire, and possession. The hall exhaled collectively, whispers dying, awe replacing fear, and Liora, standing tall, chest swelling with the thrill of triumph and anticipation, felt the invisible melody of connection with Dorian pulse stronger, a harmony that promised both romance and power, intimacy and destiny. And as the storm outside the Citadel walls howled, echoing the turbulence of intrigue still lurking beyond, they stood together, silent, tethered, victorious yet aware, the final test not merely survived, but mastered, the revelation complete, and the rejected Omega and the Alpha King shared a heartbeat, a glance, a silent understanding that what had begun as trial and danger had now become the foundation of a bond unbreakable, a melody of courage, love, and shared destiny, ready to face whatever the next storm would bring. The dawn broke over Stormhold's citadel with a brilliance that seemed to wash away the shadows of the past, the golden light spilling across obsidian towers, glinting off banners embroidered with the crest of the Alpha King, and Liora stood at the highest balcony of the citadel, her cloak whispering around her like a promise, chest rising and falling with anticipation, and the quiet surge of pride that came from survival, mastery, and triumph. Her soul song thrumming softly, a silent harmony vibrating through the stones, the air, and the hearts of those below, resonating with the collective pulse of the citadel, now alive with excitement. Nobles and citizens alike gathering in the sprawling courtyard to witness a moment of history, a coronation not only of a king, but of the Omega who had defied expectations, survived betrayal, and claimed her rightful place beside him. Dorian emerged beside her, golden eyes gleaming with pride, authority, and a rare, tender light reserved only for her, his armor gleaming in the morning sun, a subtle aura of power radiating around him, and as he extended his hand, Liora took it, her fingers brushing his, a spark igniting that neither could deny, an invisible tether of heartbeats, desire, courage, and shared destiny connecting them as if the world itself had conspired to bring them together. And the crowd below, sensing the bond radiating from the balcony, fell into a hushed awe. The whispers of scandal, fear, and doubt silenced entirely in the presence of the undeniable connection between the Alpha King and his rejected Omega, a partnership that now commanded both respect and reverence. The ceremonial hall inside the Citadel had been transformed into a blaze of color and splendor, tapestries fluttering, golden light reflecting from polished stone, and as Dorian led Liora forward, the nobles and council members lining the aisles bowed their heads, some in awe, some in reluctant admiration, yet all recognizing the undeniable truth of the Omega's rise from rejection to power. The subtle authority that radiated from her now matched, complemented, and even enhanced that of the Alpha King, a silent declaration that her courage, empathy, and soul song were not weaknesses, but the very forces that had saved the Citadel and cemented their unbreakable bond. The high priest of Stormhold Citadel stepped forward, voice reverberating, reciting the ancient rites of bonding and rulership, and Liora, standing beside Dorian, felt the pull of the sacred energy weaving around them, the ceremonial sigils glowing faintly in response to the resonance of their hearts, the tether between them now tangible, electric, and unyielding, a connection that no scheme, curse, or danger could sever. And as the high priest raised the ceremonial crown, golden light catching on its intricate engravings, Dorian's hands encircled hers, warm, protective, possessive, and infinitely tender, their eyes locking in a moment that carried years of fear, longing, triumph, and love. A silent vow of devotion that needed no words to be understood by either of them or by the captivated audience witnessing history. The crown was placed upon Dorian's head first, a symbol of leadership, strength, and authority. But the true climax came as the high priest lifted Leora's own delicate circlet, setting it gently upon her head, a shimmering emblem of resilience, power, and love. And in that instant, the courtiers, nobles, guards, and citizens erupted into a roar of applause and cheer, the sound echoing through the citadel like thunder. Yet in the midst of it, the Alpha and Omega shared a private heartbeat, a pulse of unspoken intimacy, a communion of souls that resonated above and beyond the clamor, their tether vibrating in perfect harmony, the soul song of Liora entwined with the Alpha's golden aura, a melody of triumph, love, trust, and destiny that no one could break or ignore. And as they turned to face the gathered crowd, hands clasped tightly, Liora felt the thrill of authority, the joy of recognition, the intoxicating warmth of love acknowledged and celebrated, the sense of completion mingling with the anticipation of a future they would shape together, a kingdom built not on fear, but on courage, empathy, and shared devotion, her silent heart singing in harmony with the Alpha's golden fire, an eternal melody that spoke louder than any roar or word ever could. Dorian whispered then, his voice low and intimate, meant only for her, despite the thousands watching, "Together, always." And Leora's soul song echoed in response, a silent, shimmering affirmation that transcended sound, a vow that their bond would endure through storms, betrayal, and triumph alike, a promise sealed not by ceremony alone, but by heart, courage, and the trials they had endured, the trials that had revealed their love and solidified their unbreakable union. The sun rose higher, illuminating the courtyard, the banners waving proudly, the courtiers and citizens clapping and cheering, the conspirators, Malric and Vela, now exposed and powerless, slipping quietly into disgrace, and Celine's pride shattered, replaced by reluctant awe as she witnessed the Omega who had been rejected rise not merely as a survivor, but as a queen, a partner, and an equal to the Alpha King, their bond an unassailable force that commanded loyalty, respect, and reverence. And as the last echoes of celebration faded, Dorian drew Liora close, their foreheads touching, breaths mingling, the invisible tether between them thrumming with warmth, trust, love, and quiet triumph, a melody that resonated through every corner of Stormhold Citadel. And in that perfect, suspended moment, they shared their first unspoken, intimate understanding of a life together, a partnership forged in fire, intrigue, and emotion. A love that had survived rejection, manipulation, and danger, stronger and more radiant than either could have imagined. And as they stood together, hands entwined, eyes locked, hearts synchronized, the rejected Omega and the Alpha King embraced their destiny, not as ruler and subject, not as survivor and protector, but as equals, mates, and eternal partners. Their bond celebrated and immortalized, a story of courage, empathy, love, and triumph that would echo in the halls of Stormhold for generations. The final chapter of rejection transformed into everlasting love, and the sun shone brighter than ever, a herald of hope, peace, and the unbreakable union of the Alpha King and his silent, powerful, and victorious Omega.